Good evening. Glad to have everybody out here in the midweek. Looking forward to a good night of Bible study. Just a couple of quick notes tonight. If you were able to pick up one of our announcement sheets, you'll notice many of our typical summaries of those people we need to continue to pray for, different activities going on. A couple of things that stood out today were that if you didn't know, Noah Garner is in Vanderbilt Children's Hospital being treated for pneumonia. So we certainly want to keep the Garner family in our prayers. Just a few more days before the Magi boxes are due. Please keep in mind that as you ship a box, there is $8 to ship each box. Your announcement sheet gives you very clear instructions about how to clarify that $8 to where it gets appropriated the correct way. A few things like our Guys and Grubs meeting is coming up on September the 12th. If you've never been to that, that's a nice event. A game night next Friday. Also, there's going to be a congregational wedding shower this coming, that is for McCarley Thomas and Andrew Golden on Sunday, October the 27th. It's already noted here, so I got ahead of myself. We've actually got a congregational wedding shower this Sunday night for Bailey White and Tyler Pegg. That'll be after services. Bailey and Tyler are registered at the Knott Registry, Amazon, and Target. Tonight, leading us in singing will be Colton Hawkins. Shortly after that, we'll be given a short devotion by Matthew Rochford, and then we'll be closed in prayer by Asher Barnes. If you will, please stand.
Jesus, you're my firm foundation. I know I can stand secure. Jesus, you're my firm foundation. I put my hope in your holy word. I put my hope in your holy word. I have a living hope. I have a future.
Last Tuesday, I had a chemistry quiz. I had studied some, but probably not as much as I should have. My weekend leading up to the quiz had been spent enjoying the state fair, watching football, and doing various tasks outside. When Monday came, I was beginning to feel concerned that the quiz might not go so well. After all, I had only studied for 20 minutes, at most, over the weekend. When fifth period chemistry came on Tuesday, I was concerned that despite my last-minute cramming, I might not be quite ready for the quiz. Without an option at this point, though, I took my quiz. Once I finished it, I felt that such a heavy load had been lifted off my back, and that I didn't need to worry about a thing anymore. It gave me such a sense of relief, even if I didn't make the best grade. Now, I'm sure that you've all had this kind of feeling to an extent before, whether it's been deadlines that you needed to meet at work or the tensions that you felt near the end of the Tennessee versus Alabama game when Tennessee kicked the winning field goal. We have all carried weight that we've needed to be relieved of. On my way home that day of the chemistry quiz, I realized that I may have been going about the quiz all wrong. Maybe I had stressed too much about how I would do on it. Had I just remembered in the first place that I can cast my burdens on the Lord, I wouldn't have felt the same kind of pressure. Psalm 55:22 tells us, "Cast your cares on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken." If I had said a prayer sooner, asking God to help me do well on the quiz and not stress so much about it, I believe that I wouldn't have felt relieved when the quiz was over because I wouldn't have been carrying that weight in the first place. Instead, I would have remembered that though I had not studied as much as I should have over the weekend, I had done everything else in my power to be ready by listening in class, taking notes, and studying the night before for about an hour and 20 minutes. And that how I do on the little science quiz wouldn't determine my salvation or my relationship with God. Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." In the grand scheme of things, that quiz was really not all that important, because the most important thing is that I live for God and seek to honor and glorify Him in every way that I can. I like what my mom has told me before when I've been stressing about a big test or something. "This is not going to determine whether you go to heaven," she'd say. While it's important to try to do well in what we do, it's much more important that we belong to Christ and that we live for Him each and every day. 1 Peter 2:38 tells us to repent and be baptized, to have our sins forgiven, and to receive the Holy Spirit. Tonight, if you don't yet belong to Christ, or if there's something that you need to address, please come forward and let go of your burdens as we stand and sing.
Let's go to God in prayer. Dear God in heaven, thank you so much for today. Thank you so much for all you've done for us. I ask that this time that you be with our church family and everybody who's in it. I ask that you be with the sick and the shut-in. And I also ask that you be with the participants who are going to Bible Bowl and all that they've studying, that it will pay off and help them do well. I ask that you be with our church and the elders and the deacons. I ask that you be with the safety of Brentwood and Nolensville and all these areas that we're living in. Please keep us all healthy and safe and during this time. And please help us to have good classes tonight and throughout this new quarter. It's in your Son's name I pray. Amen.
If it works. All right. Hey, I am here. Yes. Well, this is a new experience for me. I've never taught in this room. This is, yes, rather intimidating, but we'll get through it. All right. Let's see if this is working okay. You are in the class of Manners and Customs of Bible Times, and I'm teaching primarily out of this book here, and it's and that there is the picture from the first open page, but then over the years, I've taught this at least 3 times before. I'm pretty sure in the last 30-something years, and as time goes by, when I'm able to visit different places and museums and such, I'll collect what information I can because it's a subject that interests me so much, and I'm hoping that you find it interesting and helpful in your study of the Bible. The thing that we're wanting to get here is, if you've read the little paragraph we had about the Bible classes, that pretty much tells the introduction of the class and why we want to do this. But we're wanting to try to understand what was going on in these people's lives back then, and understand the language of the Bible and the terminology, what it refers to, and as well as what we can do that is to understand the particular places and times and people. And we can do that by placing ourselves in the context that they lived in. So that's what we're working on here. See if my changer works. Good. The first thing we'll look at is, and we're looking at this section about individual and family life and different aspects of that. First thing we're looking at is clothing. And this picture on here is from sunrise at the Sea of Galilee. Beautiful place to be. The first thing, talking about clothing, is the basic wardrobe, or the wardrobe was fairly basic, and there were slight variations in color and material and style, but the several different things that they wore, they maybe wore a loincloth beneath a tunic, and then some form of headwear, and footwear and a coat were options. Now, clothing was not easy to come by for most people. It was very costly. The poor had only the clothes that they stood up in. That's all they had to wear. And this helps us understand Amos 2, verse 6 says, "This is what the Lord says, for 3 sins of Israel, even for 4, I will not turn back my wrath. They sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals." At that time, when the Assyrians were about to take the northern kingdom captive, the poor person was only worth a pair of shoes. Luke 3:11 was also quite revolutionary when John the Baptist said, "The man with 2 tunics should share with him who has none, and the one who has food should do the same." Since clothes were so important and expensive, think about what an intense sign of grief and mourning it would be to tear your clothing, to tear it to pieces, and just as Job tore his robe, and many other times we've seen in the Bible. Well, clothes of this kind were best for a relatively hot climate. Colossians 3, verse 12, Paul says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience." And here Paul uses the tunic as a metaphor for the lifestyle of God's chosen people. The undergarment, the loincloth that I mentioned before, was also something that is mentioned in the Scriptures. Here we have in John 21:7, which Dan was preaching from on Sunday morning, so we've already should be fresh in your minds if you were here, that when Peter and the others were out fishing, and Jesus came up to the shore and called out to them, and then when John realized it was Jesus, he said, "It is the Lord." And NIV says, as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. If you look at the different versions, you'll get an idea of what he was talking about here. Down in the ESV, where it says stripped for work, that's the terminology they use. They take off their tunic, their main piece of clothing, and just have the loincloth on, or even be naked, which is what it says in the King James. That's actually the term that is used. That's the actual literal translation of the term there, naked or poorly clothed. And so, in the idea is that was what they called stripped for work. When they're out on the boat, just men out there freeing themselves to be able to work more easily and also just stay cooler, I'm sure, too. They would take off their tunic. That was called stripped for work. This is an interesting thing for me when it says the term naked. Nino uses that term sometimes in a way that from her home in the Republic of Georgia, that she'll see a woman who is not clothed very modestly and say she's naked, which really means poorly clothed or not wearing enough clothing, but not really technically naked. And that's probably what it meant here. Now, the tunic, again, was the essential piece of clothing. And the men's tunic was short and colored, and the women's would be longer, ankle length, and blue. And it was made of two pieces of material and that were sewn together at a horizontal seam at the waist level. And then Jesus' tunic would have been the latest in fashion because it did not have the seam. It was all made of one piece. And that could only have been done during his lifetime. That was not possible earlier. In fact, we see the soldiers, when they had crucified him, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier, and also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. That's what that's talking about. The tunic was like a sack with openings, just pulling a sack on top of you, openings for the arms, opening for the head to come through. And actually it was usually sold without the head opening cut, so that somebody knew they were getting something new that had never been used before. Then they would cut a V opening in there for the head to come through. It could be made of wool, linen, or cotton, depending on the person's wealth, and could be made of sackcloth, which is goat's hair. But that would be very uncomfortable. It caused skin irritation, and that's what was worn in times of mourning, the sackcloth. They'd sit in sackcloth and ashes, they talk about. The girdle. They could wear a leather or coarse cloth belt, and they call it a girdle. If you look on this fella here, it looks like that's what he's wearing right there. And it could be a slit to make a pocket for money. Jesus talks about that in Mark 6, verse 8, when he's telling the apostles, when he's sending them out to teach. He says, "Take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in your belts." That's what he's talking about, the girdle. It was useful for the insertion of weapons or tools. In 1 Samuel 25, it talks about David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. I was talking about tucking it into his girdle. For freedom to work or for running, they lifted the hem and tucked it into the girdle to be able to move about more freely. You see that again also on this fella on the picture here, how he's brought it up and tucked it into the girdle. That's called girding up the loins, which if anybody who's read the King James Version knows that term. And it's a metaphor for preparedness. It means being ready. In 1 Peter 1:13, again, the King James Version has the literal writing. Gird up the loins of your mind. That's what it actually said. But most modern translations, like the New American Standard, say, prepare your minds for action, which giving the actual meaning, what it means, to make more sense to us. Now, there were no night clothes to wear at the end of the day. They just loosen the girdle and lie down in the tunic. That's what you had to wear. The cloak was worn on top of the tunic if you were wealthy enough to have one, to be able to afford one, or if there was cold weather and it just made it necessary, kind of like having a coat to wear. And this was the only form of protection for many people. Even if it was taken in pledge for a loan, it had to be returned to the owner before nightfall for sleeping purposes. And this is it mentions that in Exodus 22. It says, if you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, return it to him by sunset, because his cloak is the only covering he has for his body. What else will he sleep in? When he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. The cloak was made in two forms. First of all, wrapping thick woolen material around the body, kind of like this guy in the forefront here. And that always makes me think of when Vacation Bible School time comes. The most basic, easiest thing you can do for getting into clothing like people had back in Bible times, just put on your bathrobe and your pair of sandals and you're ready to go. And it's really true, though, how much that looks like or is like what they wore when they had the cloak on. Second type of cloak is the loose dressing gown with wide sleeves. And of course, these are wealthy people on the picture here. And when it was made of silk, it was a very luxurious garment. A wealthy person would never think of going out of doors without his cloak on. Pharisees wore blue fringes at the bottom of the cloaks. They wanted to be in keeping with the law, which was recorded in Numbers 15, where it says, speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corners of your garments with a blue cord on each tassel. But, as they often did, they took this practice to an ostentatious level, which Jesus condemned in Matthew 23, verse 5. He said, everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. And he mentions phylacteries here, so I was going to show a couple of pictures of that. The picture on the left is from the book. This is a man and his son going to the boy's bar mitzvah. And they've got the phylacteries on their head, the boxes containing pieces of scripture, and on their arms also, the strapping on there. The picture on the right is one that I took when we were in Jerusalem. And this man was just a little ways off from us, but he unfortunately stepped into something black. But right there you can see, if you look closely enough, maybe you can see the phylactery on his head. And he's also got the straps on his forearms there. Okay. Now the other thing was concerning the cloak. If you remember the woman who had the hemorrhage and wanted to touch the bottom part or the hem of Jesus' garment, as we remember that term. Well, that was the edge of his cloak, the bottom part of his cloak. That's in Matthew 9, verse 20. It says, a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. This picture shows how the women would be dressed. The poorer woman with her tunic on, which is full length, and of course the rich woman in the background. Now, how many people here have been to the Ark up in Kentucky? Yeah, I highly recommend it if you can get up there to that. How many have been to the Creation Museum, which is a little ways off from there, about 45 minutes away? If you're going to go to the Ark, you've got to make time to go to the Creation Museum too. That's my opinion. I've been there a couple of times, and it was a wonderful experience. But this last time we went, last year, at the Creation Museum, they had an exhibit called Borderland. And it's showing a lot of drawings and mannequins and things that they have made, exhibits, I guess I should say, about people back in the time of Jesus, and showing an idea of what it was like then. And we were able to get a book that has pictures of all that and telling about how they made it. It looked like they had really put a lot of research into how they did this. I'm just going to run through quickly some pictures of some of the stuff from that. I thought it was very well done. Like it shows here what people of royalty would look like, kind of clothing they would be wearing. And probably all heard about the purple robes, and later on I'll talk more about that in the class. But then politicians, a governor and a jurist, and the estate owners, the landholder, the tax farmer. I'd never heard of a tax farmer before. I've heard of tax collectors, but the tax farmer was the one who was above them. He was a guy who had a whole control over a whole area, and he employed different tax collectors to collect the taxes for him. So not only were the tax collectors making a lot of money, collecting too much, then they were feeding it to him. And here's tradespeople, craftsman, tax collector, shop owner, farm manager, weaver, and tradespeople again, family helper or a soldier or an apprentice, a young boy learning the trade. The slaves. And notice the physician is a slave. The physician could be a slave or a free man. And it wasn't necessarily a free man. Anybody could aspire to become a physician. And the scribe with his writing kit on his side. And then again, slaves, the business manager of the area or the home, the household worker. And then at the very bottom of the social strata was the day laborers. They were even lower than the slaves. Slaves were kind of like the people who had a steady job. The day laborers are the ones who were having to scrounge up something to do each day just to get by. And we read about those type of people in the Bible also. They were standing around in the marketplace looking for work. That was the day laborers. Okay, back to the clothing, just a little bit more on that. The footwear that people would wear. And these pictures are taken from some footwear that was found in Masada. And the bottom photo is women's sandals. The poor often walked barefoot, though, couldn't even afford the sandals. And others wore simple sandals, and it was the sole was made of cowhide to match the shape of the foot. Then a long thong was passed through the sole and between the first and second toes and tied around the ankle. And who do we know talked about tying the thongs of the sandal? John the Baptist. In Luke 3:16, he says, "But one more powerful than I will come, the thongs of whose sandals I'm not worthy to untie." And they say that the priest may have gone barefoot in the temple as a sign of reverence. Headwear was something that they wore also. The men apparently wore a skull cap with a piece of material folded into a band around the turned up edge so that it gave the appearance of a turban. And women would wear a square of material folded to make a sun shield for their eyes, and it allowed it to fall in folds over the neck and the shoulders to give full protection from the sun. It was held in place by a braided cord. Sometimes the women would wear a light veil over the head, especially if they were not supposed to show their face in a public place. I'm not real clear. It talked about how only the husband could look at her face, but I'm thinking that might have been in earlier times. I'm not sure by Jesus' time if they were still covering their face all the time. But we do have the example of when Abraham's servant brought Rebekah for Isaac to marry. when she first saw him in the distance, and the servant said, "That's who he is," she took her veil and covered herself so he wouldn't see her before they were married. Speaking of marriage, at a marriage ceremony, the veil was lifted from the bride's face and laid on the shoulders of the bridegroom to the declaration, "The government shall be upon his shoulders." That's Isaiah 9, verse 6, a very familiar phrase there. Here's some more head coverings from the Borderland exhibit. So mostly women, but there is a couple of men there. The next photo is of things from Roman times. It's kind of hard to see that, but you can make out a few items there that they used in their clothing and cosmetics. And the next one is a Roman ivory comb. And the name on the comb says Modestina. There are also Roman-era combs made of boxwood. And these were found in the caves in Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. The side with the fine teeth was useful for removing lice. Little things like that we just don't even think about, but they had to deal with on a daily basis, I guess. A couple more things about clothing before we move on to the next subject is Deuteronomy 22:5 says, "A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this." Very timely verse, actually, for us as well. But it was timely for them because probably was referencing the fact that part of the Canaanite religion was their sexual stimulation, the problems they had with that. And that was probably something that they were doing then. And the last thing is possibly the most well-known piece of clothing in the Bible, the coat of many colors. Genesis 37:3 in the NIV says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. He made a richly ornamented robe for him." Or the New American Standard calls it a vari-colored tunic or a full-length robe. The English Standard Version says robe of many colors or robe with long sleeves. The meaning is uncertain. We don't know exactly what it was. But the important thing to remember is it was probably a tunic made of many pieces, probably long sleeves, which would have been a nuisance and get in the way if you're doing any kind of work. In fact, women with their clothing, with their tunic, had long sleeves, and they would often pull it up and tie it behind their back of their neck to hold it out of the way, and have their arms free. But this indicated that Joseph was not expected to do heavy work. He was the chosen heir to rule over the family. And okay, all right. Any comments you'd like to make about the clothing, or before I move on? How did it compare to what the Romans were wearing? I don't know. See, I'll admit when I don't know something. It may happen a lot. I don't know. It's a good question, though. All right. Next thing we're going to look at is dwellings. What did they live in? And I like to put up pictures and trying to make things interesting. This is a picture from Capernaum and of the houses that were uncovered there in the archaeological work. Before we actually talk about what kind of things they lived in, let's talk about the dividing of the land for a moment. The Israelites gained the land by conquest, we know that. And every tribe and family looked upon the inheritance or allotment as from God. The land was divided in the second half of the book of Joshua. That's where we can see how that was done. It was divided by line and allocated by lot. The lots may have been potsherds, like pieces of broken pottery, stones, sticks, dice, or a two-sided disc. And casting lots would give them God's will. We see there's several examples of that we can see in the Bible. In Numbers 26, it talks about, be sure that the land is distributed by lot. What each group inherits will be according to the names for its ancestral tribe. Each inheritance is to be distributed by lot among the larger and smaller groups. Proverbs 16:33 says, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And then Psalm 16 says, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. The landmarks that they would use for the land might be a heap of stones or some sort of natural feature or a double furrow of plowed land. But the landmarks could never be moved. That would alter the gift of God. Deuteronomy 19 says, do not move your neighbor's boundary stones set up by your predecessors in the inheritance you receive in the land the Lord your God has given you to possess. It's a very important thing. Now in 1 Kings 21, I find this interesting. This is the story about Ahab and Naboth. If you remember, King Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. And King Ahab goes to him. Just think about it. He's the king. He could do whatever he wanted. He could just take it, seems to me. But especially a king like Ahab would have just taken it. But he goes to Naboth and says, I'll pay you more than what it's worth. Or I'll give you another one that's even better. Or something like that. It sounded like a really good deal. Well, Naboth, no, I can't do that. But he said, Naboth replied, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. It was dishonoring to God to sell one's inheritance. So that's why he wouldn't sell to Ahab. And speaking of selling the land, even though it was dishonoring to God to sell, and you shouldn't do that, on certain occasions, people fall on hard times. And they would need to get some cash value from the property. So at those times, they could sell the land, but it had to be returned to the original owner in the year of Jubilee. And that was every 50 years. Leviticus 25:10 says, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each one of you is to return to his family property and each to his own clan. The sale value was based on the number of years left until Jubilee. Now, such transfers were very carefully arranged and monitored. The money was weighed, the deeds were drawn up and describing every detail in the presence of witnesses. And examples of this can be seen in Genesis 23 when Abraham is buying the cave of Machpelah to be able to bury Sarah there. And also in Jeremiah 32 where Jeremiah is buying a field. It describes a lot of the details they went through. A member of the extended family could also buy back the land on behalf of the ones that sold it at any time. The story of Ruth and Boaz in Ruth chapter 4 is an example of this. The people of the land, there was an inseparable link between the people and the land. The land passed from fathers to sons, the eldest son receiving twice as much. Joseph received a double portion in the names of his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, I've heard that explained as that Joseph was considered the heir because, he wasn't the oldest son by any stretch of the imagination. He was the 11th of those sons, of those 12. But he was the first son of the woman who was supposed to have been the first wife. Now, I don't know, maybe that's it, but I still think it comes back to he was Jacob's favorite. you can probably do all this convoluted thinking trying to justify it, or maybe that's what he thought. I don't know. But he was considered the heir. 2 Kings 2 verse 9 talks about when Elijah is going to pass over, or was going to be leaving, and Elisha is going to take his place. Elijah says, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I'm taken from you?" And Elisha says, "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." And so that was, he was asking for the inheritance of the oldest son. The prodigal son in Luke 15 would have received a third of the estate, the older son, 2/3 of it. And in fact, that means when the older son was talking to his father later on after the younger one had returned, the father says, "My son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours." It literally was. Everything he'd given him. In Numbers 27 answers the question, could daughters inherit? That was something that had not been mentioned. Well, these daughters of this man came to Moses, I believe, and asked if they could inherit from their father, and he decided yes, they could when there was no sons. Places they lived. In very early times, people would live in caves. In fact, Lot lived in a cave after he had escaped from Sodom. In Obadiah 3, it mentions that the Edomites made and enlarged caves, and we know that it was at Petra for living in public affairs. There were caves under the homes in Nazareth, and there is a tradition that Jesus was born in a shepherd's cave. They were used for escape. There were 5 Amorite kings who hid from Joshua in caves. David hid in caves from Saul. Obadiah hid 100 prophets from Jezebel in 2 caves in 1 Kings 18. And the Philistines taunted Jonathan and his armor bearer when they showed themselves to the Philistine outposts. They said, "Look, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." But by Bible times, most people were living in settlements with good defensive positions, with a water supply, or they had a semi-nomadic form of life, living in tents and moving with herds from oasis to oasis. And that brings us to the sand dwellers. Abraham left the settled community of Ur in Chaldea and became a sand dweller. And the mode of life of the modern Bedouin is similar. There's never really been fully deserted. In fact, that's what these pictures are. Modern Bedouins living in tents and living a nomadic life. The Jewish Feast of Tabernacles is a constant, or was a constant reminder of Israel's past when they were living in tents before they came into the Promised Land. And Passover also became a camping festival as thousands of people made their way to Jerusalem. We can look at tent life as a metaphor. When the prophets were trying to call materialistically minded people back to God, they reminded them of the time spent in the desert and on the move. John 1:14 says, "The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us." Made His dwelling literally says He tented Himself, or He camped among us, to emphasize the temporary nature of Jesus' time on earth. And 2 Corinthians 5:1-4 says, "Now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life." Here Paul uses the temporary nature of a tent to describe our own lives on this earth. The tent itself was made of goat's hair, and we mentioned goat's hair earlier when we were talking about sackcloth. It was erected on a series of poles to provide a long awning. The Song of Solomon refers to the tents as being dark or black. There were vertical hangings made from worn roof coverings or from other brightly colored materials. And these hangings provided a front and back for the tent and divisions in between. They could also form a type of porch to sit in. In Genesis 18, when the men came to Abraham to tell him that Sarah was going to have a child, let me just read the first couple of verses there. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. Of course, the hangings that formed the walls also made it possible for Sarah to be standing just on the other side and to hear the conversation from inside. The tent could be extended by simply weaving an extra length to the original awning and providing an additional hanging curtain. Isaiah 54:2 uses this as a metaphor for Jewish expansion. It says, "Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch your tent curtains wide, do not hold back, lengthen your cords, strengthen your stakes." Now, the tent awnings were not waterproof until the first rains of the season had caused the cloth to shrink. And they placed rugs on the ground to help with that. The only male adult allowed in was the husband or the father. Other men remained in the porch area. Tents were not always primitive. Kings would travel in the tents with the army. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the Feast of Tabernacles or Feast of Booths reminded the people of when they lived in tents and wandered in the desert. Well, by the time Joshua and the semi-nomadic Israelites had taken over the Canaanite towns and villages, housing had already come a long way from living in caves. Homes developed to the single rectangular room that's still typical today. The materials used for the houses could be sun-dried mud bricks or bricks fired in a kiln, squared stones. In the time of Solomon, they had that. In Galilee, they had black basalt, which is a volcanic rock. It's up on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. It's just everywhere. Along the coast, they have yellow sandstone to build with, but most of the areas they used white limestone. And as I recall, that's what you see more around Jerusalem. It made me think about something Nino told me. It just depends on what materials you have available. There's an area in Georgia, and it's not an area of rich people, but the poor people have made their houses out of marble, because there's marble everywhere. That's what they have to work with. The rich people get some brick and build with that. We would think of it the other way around. I would. That marble would be the kind of thing that would be like a palace. The houses are looked upon as a gift of God, so there was an act of dedication when they were first built. In Deuteronomy 20, verse 5, in fact, it says, "The officer shall say to the army, 'Has anyone built a new house and not dedicated it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle, and someone else may dedicate it.'" The basic house was a single room, 10 feet square, thick walls of mud brick or rough stone and rubble, and niches in the wall for storage of food and utensils. There might be a small and high single window like you see in the picture there. The walls were poorly built, and they harbored various kinds of animal life. Interesting verse in Amos 5:19 says, "It will be as though a man fled from a lion only to meet a bear, as though he entered his house and rested his hand on the wall only to have a snake bite him." Can you imagine coming in your house and putting your hand on the wall and a snake comes out to bite you? The main means of entry for light was through the single open door, which was shut by a wooden bar at night. And inside at night, they would have an oil lamp burning and standing on a projection from the wall or in an alcove or on some form of utensil. In fact, Jesus refers to that in Matthew 5:15, which says, "Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house." The floor was divided into two parts. Nearest the door, it was leveled and stamped down, but with stamped down earth. At the back of the room would be a raised platform of stone used for family activities. They would do their eating, their sitting there, and then their sleeping. And a fire for heating and cooking would be set up on the lower floor with the smoke left to find its way out. Let me go through a couple of pictures here as we're running out of time. A couple more pictures this picture is from that Borderland exhibit showing housing, especially back in Jesus' time. And I think this also illustrates how when houses be built right onto each other, this has got to be more than one house here. And this is houses in Arabia, similar to those of Old Testament times. It's hard to see that picture, no. Small dwelling north of the Sea of Galilee made of black basalt. And in that same area, we visited a house there called the Arched House. And inside, Dan was explaining how it's got these arched walls all through there, very close to each other. I don't know, maybe they're 8 feet apart or something. He explained that that kind of rock or that kind of stone, they couldn't make long stones to make long roof. I don't know if you call it joists or what. And then this last picture here is of remains of a 1st century AD house in Jerusalem, burnt down in AD 70 when the Romans came. The rooms were identified by pieces of equipment that they contained. Well, that's a good place to stop. We're out of time. Appreciate everybody's attention. Thank you.